Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're settling in comfortably wherever you are in the world. How has your day been? Are you winding down for the evening, or is it already deep into the night where you are? Whether you're listening from a bustling city or a quiet countryside, from across the ocean or just down the road, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. If you enjoy stories that explore the mysteries and conspiracies that linger in the shadows of our world, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. Your support means everything and helps us keep bringing you thought-provoking tales that blur the line between fact and fiction. And while you're here, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened with TWA Flight 800? Was it a tragic accident or something more? Let me know in the comments and feel free to share which conspiracy theories you'd like to hear explored next. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin tonight's story. Now let's begin our journey into the dark waters off Long Island, where on a summer evening in 1996, the sky lit up with more than just the setting sun. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 months after I'd last spoken to my brother Callum. The voice on the other end was crisp, military precise, the kind that delivers bad news without flinching. "Mr. Muir, this is Captain Davidson from Naval Station Norfolk. I'm calling about your brother, Callum Muir. There's been an accident." My coffee cup hit the kitchen counter harder than I intended. "What kind of accident?" "A fall, sir. He was found at the bottom of a stairwell in Building 7. I'm very sorry for your loss." The words hung in the air like smoke. Callum, my younger brother by 4 years, had always been the careful one. While I'd spent my Navy years crawling through submarine engine rooms and later working sonar systems for defence contractors, Callum had risen through the ranks as a systems analyst, the kind of guy who triple-checked every calculation and never missed a detail. "A fall?" I repeated. "Yes, sir. The investigation is ongoing, but preliminary findings suggest he lost his footing on the stairs. These old buildings, you know how they are. I knew those buildings. I'd spent enough time in them during my own service. Those stairs had railings, good lighting, textured steps for grip. Callum falling down them made about as much sense as a submarine flying." The funeral was held on a grey Thursday in Virginia Beach. The turnout was respectable, but not large. Callum had been a private person, dedicated to his work, but not one for making friends easily. We'd grown apart over the years, especially after our parents died. Different coasts, different lives, different silences between phone calls that stretched longer each time. I was standing by the graveside watching the honour guard fold the flag when a woman approached me. She was in her 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that suggested military service. "Wesley Muir?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "I'm Leona Hart. I worked with Callum in the communications division." She glanced around, then stepped closer. "I'm sorry for your loss. Callum was a good man. Thorough. Maybe too thorough." Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. "What do you mean?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, the kind with a black cover and grid-lined pages. "I found this in his locker. Thought you should have it." "What is it?" "I don't know, but Callum was agitated the last few weeks before he died. Kept working late, asking questions about old files. This might explain why." I took the notebook, feeling its weight. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe that was just the weight of what I didn't yet know it contained. "Thank you," I said. But when I looked up, Leona Hart was already walking away, her heels clicking on the cemetery's paved path. That night, in my hotel room, I opened the notebook under the harsh fluorescent light. Callum's handwriting filled the pages, neat, precise, the way he'd always written. But the content was anything but orderly. "Echo Trail, CVN 73 was written at the top of the first page, underlined twice. Below that, Sabre launch failed sink, 2029. Radar silence isn't silence. 2 objects, 1 test, 1 shield. July 17th, 1996. 230 souls." Page after page of cryptic notes, coordinates, timestamps, and references to files with designations I didn't recognise. But one thing was clear: July 17th, 1996. The date TWA Flight 800 exploded off the coast of Long Island. I'd been working sonar systems for Raytheon at the time, designing underwater detection arrays. I remembered that night, not because I was anywhere near Long Island, but because every defence contractor on the East Coast spent the following weeks answering questions about what we knew, what we'd seen, what we might have detected. The official story was simple: a fuel tank explosion. Tragic, inexplicable, but these things happened. Aging aircraft, electrical faults, volatile fuel vapours. The investigation took years, but the conclusion was definitive. So why was my brother, a Navy systems analyst, filling a notebook with references to that flight 3 months before he died? I kept reading. The notes became more detailed, more urgent. References to radar logs, audio transcripts, satellite imagery, and repeatedly that designation, CVN 73. I didn't need to look it up. CVN 73 was the USS George Washington, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. But according to every public record I'd ever seen, no carrier had been operating in the area when Flight 800 went down. According to every public record. I closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling. Outside my hotel window, Virginia Beach stretched into darkness, the same darkness that had swallowed my brother's questions and apparently my brother himself. Back in Seattle, I couldn't concentrate on work. My consulting contract with the Navy involved updating sonar detection algorithms, dry technical work that usually absorbed my attention completely. But now, every time I looked at a radar display or sonar readout, I thought about Callum's notebook. I transcribed his notes trying to make sense of the cryptic references. Some I could decode easily. CVN 73 was definitely the George Washington. Others required research. Sabre launch appeared to be a reference to a missile system, though I couldn't find any public information about it. The timestamp 2029 was intriguing. Flight 800 had exploded at 2031 local time on July 17th, 1996. 2 minutes before the explosion, something called Sabre launch had experienced a failed sink. I started reaching out to old contacts, former colleagues from my Navy days in the defence industry. Most were reluctant to talk about anything classified, but a few were willing to share what they knew about carrier operations in the summer of 1996. That's how I learned about the gap. Marcus Chen, who'd worked air traffic control for the Navy, met me at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle. He was nervous, constantly checking his phone and looking over his shoulder. "The George Washington," he said, stirring his coffee for the third time. "You're asking about her position in July 96. "Generally speaking," I said carefully. "Just curious about East Coast operations during that period." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "There's something weird about that time frame. I was working carrier scheduling then, and there's a gap in the Washington's public deployment records. She was supposed to be in Norfolk for maintenance from July 10th to July 25th. But I remember getting tasking orders for her during that period. Movement orders. Nothing in the official logs, but I processed them myself." He leaned forward. "Wesley, why are you asking about this?" I couldn't tell him about Callum, not yet. "Just following up on some old sonar data, trying to correlate some readings with known ship positions." He nodded, but I could see he wasn't entirely convinced. "Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there were a lot of irregular operations that summer. Exercise schedules that didn't match public announcements, units disappearing from tracking systems for days at a time. What kind of exercises? Missile tests mostly. New guidance systems, the kind of stuff that required clear airspace and sealed communications." Marcus drained his coffee and stood up. "I need to go, but Wesley, if you're really digging into this, be careful. There are some things the Navy prefers to keep buried." That afternoon, I drove to the University of Washington Library. If there were gaps in the official records, maybe I could find traces in other sources. News reports, maritime traffic, even amateur radio logs from that period. What I found was disturbing. The FAA radar data from the night of July 17th had been heavily redacted in all publicly released versions. But buried in a congressional hearing transcript from 1998, I found references to anomalous radar contacts and unexplained signal interruptions during the critical time frame. More troubling were the witness statements that had been excluded from the official NTSB report. I found dozens of accounts from pilots, fishermen, and coastal residents who reported seeing a streak of light, or missile trail, rising from the ocean moments before the explosion. One account from a commercial pilot flying 15 miles south of the explosion site was particularly detailed. We observed a bright object ascending from the ocean surface at approximately 20:29 local time. The object appeared to be under powered flight, leaving a visible trail. 2 minutes later, we observed a large explosion at approximately the same bearing. The pilot's statement had been taken by FBI investigators, but was never included in the final report. According to a footnote I found in a maritime law journal, the pilot had been advised by federal authorities that his observations were mistaken. I spent the rest of the week diving deeper into the records, cross-referencing every detail I could find. The picture that emerged was far different from the official narrative. On July 17th, 1996, multiple military vessels had been operating in waters south of Long Island, despite public records showing no scheduled exercises in the area. Radar systems had experienced technical difficulties at crucial moments. Audio recordings of air traffic control communications had been classified and in some cases destroyed. And according to a leaked Pentagon memo I found in a conspiracy theory forum, someone had been asking questions about all of this in the weeks before my brother died. I printed out everything I'd found and spread it across my living room floor. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, but it was a pattern that made my stomach turn. If Callum had been investigating the same things I was now looking into, he'd been getting close to something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Close enough to be dangerous. Close enough to die for. The call came from a blocked number on a Sunday morning. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. "Is this Wesley Muir?" The voice was rough, like someone who'd spent too many years smoking cigarettes and breathing diesel fumes. "Who's asking?" "Someone who knew your brother. Someone who knows what he was working on." I sat up straighter. "Who is this?" "Jonas Dray. I was a sonar operator on the tree line. Your brother found me 3 weeks before he died." The tree line? I'd never heard of it, but the designation sounded military. What did he want? Same thing you want, I'm guessing. The truth about what happened that night. There was a pause. "You want to meet? Or you want to keep stumbling around in the dark?" We arranged to meet at a diner in Tacoma, far enough from Seattle to feel anonymous, but close enough that I could drive there easily. Jonas Dray was waiting in a back booth when I arrived, a man in his 60s with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much. "Your brother was persistent," he said after we'd ordered coffee. "Kept asking questions about exercise Phantom Drift. That name mean anything to you?" I shook my head. "It should. July 17th, 1996. We were running a missile test off the coast of Long Island. New guidance system, classified as hell. The tree line was providing sonar coverage, making sure no civilian vessels wandered into the test zone. But the official records are bullshit." Jonas leaned forward. There were 5 vessels in that exercise, 2 submarines, the George Washington, and a couple of destroyers. None of them were supposed to be there according to the public schedule. What kind of missile test? Surface to air. They were testing a new interceptor system, something designed to take out incoming missiles at high altitude. The test was supposed to be conducted against a drone target. Jonas paused, looking out the window at the parking lot. But something went wrong. The targeting system malfunctioned. Instead of locking onto the drone, it locked onto the first aircraft it detected. The coffee I'd just swallowed turned bitter in my mouth. Flight 800. The missile launched at 2029. Flight 800 exploded at 2031. Do the math. But the investigation was compromised from the beginning. By the time the NTSB arrived, the Navy had already secured the debris field. Critical evidence was removed before civilian investigators could examine it. I thought about Callum's notebook, about the cryptic references to Sabre launch and failed sink. The missile system, was it called Sabre? Jonas's eyes widened slightly. "How did you—" He stopped himself. "Your brother really did his homework. Yes, the Sabre system. It was supposed to be revolutionary, a ship-based interceptor that could take out ballistic missiles at extended range. What happened to it? Officially, The programme was cancelled due to budget constraints. Unofficially, it was buried so deep that most of the people who worked on it have forgotten it ever existed. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, traffic moved past the diner windows. Ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that we were discussing the deliberate cover-up of one of the worst aviation disasters in American history. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally. Jonas finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully. "Because your brother was a good man. Because 230 people died that night, and their families deserve the truth. And because I'm tired of carrying the secret around." "What about the other crew members? The people who were on the Washington, the other submarines?" "Most of them don't know what really happened. Need-to-know basis. The missile crew thought they were firing at a drone. The sonar operators knew there was a test, but not what kind of test. Only a handful of people knew the full scope of what we were doing out there. And those people, dead. Transferred or keeping their mouths shut. Your brother was trying to track them down when he died." Jonas reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "These are copies of the sonar logs from that night. The real ones, not the sanitized versions they filed in the official report." I took the envelope, feeling its weight. "What do they show?" "Listen to them yourself." "But Wesley..." Jonas stood up and dropped a 20 on the table. "Be careful. Your brother thought he was being followed in the weeks before he died, and now you're asking the same questions he was." "Wait," I called after him, but Jonas was already walking away, his shoulders hunched against the October wind. I sat alone in the booth, staring at the envelope. Inside were what might be the only authentic records of what had really happened on July 17th, 1996. But holding them felt like holding a live grenade. By the time I got home, it was getting dark. I set up my audio equipment, professional-grade gear I use for analysing sonar recordings, and loaded the files from Jonas's flash drive. The first thing I noticed was the timestamp, 2025 local time, 6 minutes before Flight 800 exploded. The sonar contact was clear, unmistakable. A large surface vessel, moving at high speed from the south toward the civilian air corridor. At 2028, a new contact appeared on the display. Something launched from the surface vessel, climbing rapidly through the water column until it breached the surface. At 2029, the contact disappeared from sonar range as it climbed into the air. At 2031, the sonar operators detected a massive explosion at the coordinates where Flight 800 had been flying. The audio quality was excellent, and I could hear the sonar operators' voices clearly. One of them, young and excited, called out, "Contact airborne, bearing 270, climbing fast." Another voice, older and more controlled, "Confirm visual on target." "Negative visual on target, repeat, negative visual on target." A third voice, urgent now, "Something's wrong. The intercept trajectory is off. It's not heading for the drone." Then 2 minutes later, a different voice altogether. "Jesus Christ, did you see that explosion?" The recording continued for another 10 minutes, capturing the confusion and growing realization among the crew that something had gone terribly wrong. By the end of the recording, orders were being given to maintain radio silence and classify all logs from the exercise. I played the recording 3 times, each time finding new details that supported what Jonas had told me. This wasn't speculation or conspiracy theory. This was documentation of a military accident that had been covered up for decades. But it was also evidence that could destroy careers, topple governments, and put me in the same danger my brother had faced. I thought about Callum, about his careful notes and methodical investigation. He'd been close to exposing the truth, and someone had silenced him before he could go public. Now I had the same evidence, the same terrible knowledge. The question was, what was I going to do with it? 3 days after meeting Jonas, I found the message on my answering machine. A woman's voice, speaking with a slight French accent. "Mr. Muir, my name is Kaylee Vaughan. I'm a journalist from Paris. I believe we have a mutual interest in the events of July 17th, 1996. Please call me." I'd been expecting something like this. When you start digging into classified military operations, word gets around. The question was whether Kaylee Vaughan was a legitimate journalist or someone else entirely. I called the number she'd left using a prepaid phone I'd bought specifically for sensitive calls. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Muir, thank you for calling. I understand you've been investigating the circumstances surrounding TWA Flight 800. What's your interest in this?" My uncle was on that flight, Jean-Pierre Vaughan. He was travelling to New York for a business meeting. Her voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the emotion underneath. For 25 years I've been trying to understand what really happened that night. "And what have you found?" "Evidence that the official investigation was incomplete. Evidence that there were military assets in the area that night, despite official denials. And evidence that people who ask too many questions about this tend to have accidents." That last comment hit close to home. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that's better discussed in person. I'm flying to Seattle tomorrow. Can we meet?" We arranged to meet at the Pike Place Market. Public enough to be safe, but crowded enough to avoid surveillance. Kaylee Vaughan turned out to be a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it had seen a lot of use. "I've been tracking this story for 15 years, she said as we walked through the market. Started as a personal quest for answers about my uncle's death, but it became something larger. "What kind of journalist are you?" "Investigative. I work for Liberation in Paris, but I freelance for several publications. I specialise in stories that governments prefer to keep quiet." We found a coffee shop overlooking Elliott Bay and settled into a corner table. Kaylee opened her portfolio and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "These are satellite photos from July 17th, 1996, acquired through a Freedom of Information request to the European Space Agency." She spread several images across the table. "The official position is that no military vessels were operating in the area, but look at this." The satellite images were in black and white, but the details were clear. I could see multiple vessels arranged in a rough circle about 50 miles south of Long Island. One of them was clearly much larger than the others. "The large vessel here," Kaylee pointed to a distinctive shape, "matches the profile of a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. And this," she pointed to another image, "was taken 4 minutes after the explosion." The second image showed a distinctive heat signature rising from the ocean surface. It looked like a missile trail, exactly what dozens of witnesses had reported seeing. "Where did you get these?" "The ESA releases archived satellite data after 25 years. Most of it is routine weather and environmental monitoring, but occasionally you find something interesting." She pulled out another set of documents. "These are affidavits from fishermen and private boat operators who were in the area that night. All of them describe seeing a flare or bright object rising from the ocean before the explosion. I read through the statements. They were remarkably consistent, describing a light that rose from the sea at approximately 20:29 local time, followed 2 minutes later by a massive explosion at high altitude." Kaylee continued, "The FBI interviewed all of these people, but their statements were excluded from the final NTSB report. When I contacted these witnesses personally, several of them said they'd been pressured to change their stories." "Pressured how?" "Visits from federal agents, suggestions that their memories might be unreliable. In one case, a fisherman who was particularly insistent about what he'd seen had his boat impounded on trumped-up safety violations." The pattern was becoming clear, a systematic effort to suppress evidence that contradicted the official narrative. "There's something else," Kaylee said, lowering her voice. "I've been in contact with a former NTSB investigator who worked on the Flight 800 case. He's agreed to meet with us, but only under specific conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "Complete anonymity. No recordings, no photographs, no written notes during the meeting. He's terrified of being identified." We arranged to meet the investigator that evening at a restaurant in Ballard. Kaylee had chosen the location carefully, a noisy place where conversations couldn't be overheard, with multiple exits in case we needed to leave quickly. The investigator turned out to be a man in his 70s named Robert Kellerman. He'd worked for the NTSB for 35 years before retiring in 2005. He was nervous, constantly checking the restaurant's entrance and speaking in a low voice. "I shouldn't be here," he said after we'd ordered dinner, "but I've been carrying this around for too long." "What happened during the investigation?" I asked. It was compromised from the beginning. By the time our team arrived at the crash site, the Navy had already established a security perimeter. They claimed it was for safety reasons, but they were controlling access to the debris field. What kind of access? Critical pieces of the aircraft were removed before we could examine them. The Navy claimed they were potential hazards, unexploded ordnance, classified electronics from passengers' luggage, but we never got to verify that. Kellerman looked around the restaurant again before continuing. There were other irregularities, radar data that had been altered, audio recordings that were classified, witness statements that were taken by the FBI but never shared with our team. What about the fuel tank explosion theory? It was plausible, but not proven. We found evidence of an explosion in the center fuel tank, but we couldn't determine what caused it. The FBI insisted it was electrical, but we never found the source of the ignition. Did anyone on your team suspect something else? Several of us had doubts, but we were told to focus on the fuel tank theory. Other possibilities were discouraged. Kellerman reached into his jacket and pulled out a small manila envelope. These are copies of the original radar data from that night, the real data before it was sanitized. I took the envelope, feeling its weight. What do they show? See for yourself, but be careful. If anyone finds out where you got these, it won't just be my job on the line. The radar data was damning. It showed multiple contacts in the area that night, including several that appeared to be military vessels. More importantly, it showed a clear track of an object launched from the surface at 2029, climbing rapidly toward the altitude where Flight 800 had been flying. The object's trajectory was impossible to explain as debris from an exploding aircraft. It was moving too fast, climbing too steeply, and it originated from a point on the ocean surface where no part of Flight 800 had been. "This is evidence of a missile launch," I said. "That's what we thought," Kellerman replied, "but we were told to focus on other theories." "Who told you that?" "FBI agents assigned to the investigation. They said the missile theory was being handled by other agencies and was classified above our clearance level." We sat in silence for a moment, digesting the implications. The official investigation had been deliberately limited, prevented from examining evidence that contradicted the predetermined conclusion. "Mr. Kellerman," Cayley said finally, "are you willing to go on record with this information?" The old man shook his head. "I can't. I signed too many non-disclosure agreements, but I can point you toward other sources." He gave us names, contact information for other investigators and witnesses who might be willing to talk, but he made it clear that we were on our own. "Be careful," he said as we prepared to leave. "This isn't just about one airplane crash. This is about the military's ability to conduct classified operations without oversight. They've protected this secret for 25 years, and they won't hesitate to protect it for 25 more. As we walked back to our cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The street was busy, full of people enjoying the evening, but something felt wrong. "Cayley," I said quietly, "do you think we're being followed?" She glanced around casually, then nodded. "Black sedan, 2 cars behind us. It's been with us since we left the restaurant." We walked faster, taking a circuitous route back to the parking garage. The sedan stayed with us, maintaining a discreet distance but never letting us out of sight. "What do we do now?" I asked as we reached our cars. "We go public with what we have, all of it. The satellite photos, the radar data, the witness statements. We put it all online where it can't be suppressed. And then we disappear for a while, because if we're right about this, if we're really onto something, they won't let us live to tell the story." I thought about my brother Callum, about his careful investigation and cryptic notes. He'd been close to the same truth we were now approaching, and he died before he could share it with the world. The next morning, Jonah Stray was gone. I'd called him to share what Cayley and I had discovered, but his phone went straight to voicemail. When I drove to the address he'd given me, a small apartment complex in Tacoma, the building manager told me the unit had been vacated overnight. "Strange thing," the manager said, scratching his head. "Lease wasn't up for another 6 months, but he left a forwarding address." The forwarding address was a P.O. box in Spokane. When I called the postal facility, they told me the box had been paid for in cash and would be closed within the week. Jonas had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. I called Cayley immediately. She was at her hotel preparing to upload our evidence to a secure server in Switzerland. "He's gone," I told her. "Jonas disappeared overnight." "That's not good. It means they know what we're doing." "How is that possible? We've been careful." Careful isn't enough when you're dealing with people who have access to NSA-level surveillance. They've probably been monitoring our communications, tracking our movements, building a profile of our investigation. The implications were terrifying. If they could make Jonas disappear overnight, they could do the same to us. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Kaylee said. "I'm uploading everything to the server now. Once it's online, we can..." The line went dead. I tried calling back, but her phone was now going straight to voicemail. I drove to her hotel as fast as I could, but I was too late. The desk clerk told me she'd checked out unexpectedly, claiming a family emergency. Her room had been thoroughly cleaned, with no sign that she'd ever been there. I sat in the hotel parking lot trying to understand what had happened. In the space of 12 hours, both of my sources had vanished. The investigation that had consumed my life for the past month was collapsing around me, but I still had copies of the evidence, the satellite photos, the radar data, the sonar recordings. If I could get them online, get them to the right journalists, maybe their disappearance wouldn't be in vain. I drove home, planning my next move. I would upload everything to multiple servers, send copies to journalists around the world, make it impossible for the story to be suppressed. But when I arrived at my house, I knew I was too late. The front door was unlocked, though I was certain I'd locked it when I left. Inside, my home office had been thoroughly searched, not ransacked. This was professional work. But every file cabinet had been opened, every drawer examined, every computer disk removed. The copies of Callum's notebook were gone. The sonar recordings Jonas had given me were gone. The satellite photos and radar data from our meeting with Kellerman were gone. Everything was gone. I sat in my empty office, staring at the spaces where my evidence had been. 25 years of cover-up, and they'd managed to maintain it for another day. But they'd made one mistake. They'd assumed I was like my brother, methodical, careful, keeping all my eggs in one basket. I wasn't. I'd been paranoid enough to make additional copies of everything, storing them in a safety deposit box across town. The evidence still existed, but I was the only one who knew where it was. The question was, what could I do with it? That night I got the call I'd been expecting. The same blocked number Jonas had used to contact me. Mr. Muir? The voice was different this time, older, more authoritative. "I think we need to talk." "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what you've been investigating, someone who knows what happened to your brother." "Where are Jonas and Kaylee?" "They're safe for now, but their safety depends on your cooperation." The threat was clear. "What do you want?" "A meeting. Tomorrow night, 9 p.m, at the observation deck of the Space Needle. Come alone and bring whatever evidence you have. And if I don't, then you'll join your brother, and your new friends will join him too." The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone. They had me trapped. If I went to the meeting, I'd probably be killed. If I didn't, Jonas and Kaylee would be killed, and I'd be hunted down eventually anyway. But there was a third option. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I uploaded copies of all the evidence to multiple servers, with instructions to release them automatically if I didn't check in within 24 hours. I sent packages to journalists in 12 countries, with complete documentation of the TWA 800 cover-up. If they killed me, the story would still come out. If they didn't, I might have enough leverage to save Jonas and Kaylee. The next evening I arrived at the Space Needle an hour early. The observation deck was nearly empty. A few tourists taking photos, a couple watching the sunset. Normal people living normal lives. At exactly 9 p.m, a man in a dark suit approached me. He was in his 60s, with grey hair and the kind of bearing that suggested high-level government service. "Mr. Muir, thank you for coming. Where are my friends?" "Safe. For now." He gestured toward the city lights below us. "Beautiful view, isn't it? Seattle's come a long way since the Boeing days. What do you want? Your cooperation. Your silence. Your understanding that some secrets are worth keeping. Like the secret that the Navy killed 230 innocent people. Like the secret that prevents wars." His voice was calm, reasonable. "Do you understand what the world was like in 1996? The Cold War was over, but new threats were emerging. Rogue states, terrorist groups, nations that couldn't be deterred by conventional means. So you developed a weapon, we developed a defense system, a way to intercept incoming missiles before they could reach American cities. The test that night was crucial to protecting millions of lives. But it malfunctioned. It had a targeting error, a tragic accident. But the system itself was sound. Within 5 years, modified versions were protecting American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. I stared at him. You're telling me that 230 people died so you could perfect a missile defense system? I'm telling you that their deaths helped save thousands of others. The system we developed from that test has intercepted dozens of missiles over the years. It's prevented attacks on American bases, American cities, American civilians. And you covered it up. We classified it. There's a difference. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. This contains evidence that your brother's death was indeed accidental. He fell down the stairs. No foul play, no conspiracy. Just a tragic accident. I took the envelope but didn't open it. What about Jonas and Kaylee? They're being debriefed. They'll be relocated, given new identities, comfortable lives in exchange for their silence. And me? You have a choice. You can join them. New identity, new life. Generous pension in exchange for your silence. Or you can continue asking questions and face the consequences. I looked out at the city lights, thinking about my brother's notebook, about Jonas's sonar recordings, about Kaylee's satellite photos. All of it was true. All of it had been systematically suppressed for 25 years. There's a third option, I said finally. Oh. I've already uploaded everything to multiple servers. If I don't check in within the next 12 hours, the story goes public worldwide. Kill me, and you'll have confirmation of the cover-up spreading across every news outlet on the planet. The man's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker behind his eyes. You're bluffing. Am I? Check your intelligence sources. See how many servers I've uploaded to. See how many journalists are already sitting on copies of the evidence, waiting for my signal. We stared at each other for a long moment. Below us, Seattle's lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere out there, people were living their lives unaware that their government had been lying to them for decades. What do you want? He asked finally. I want Jonas and Kaylee released. I want guarantees of our safety. And I want the truth about TWA 800 to come out gradually, in a controlled manner that doesn't destroy public trust entirely. That's not possible. Then you'd better start planning for the alternative, because tomorrow morning the world is going to know what really happened on July 17th, 1996. The man was quiet for another moment, then pulled out a phone and made a brief call. When he hung up, he nodded. You have 24 hours to release your friends and provide proof of their safety. After that, I release everything. This isn't over, Mr. Muir. No, I agreed. It's just beginning. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I waited in a series of safe houses, moving every few hours, keeping my phone charged and my finger on the trigger of the digital dead man switch I'd created. At exactly 8 p.m. the following evening, I received a video call from an encrypted number. Jonas and Kaylee appeared on the screen, both looking tired but unharmed. Wesley, Kaylee's voice was clear through the connection. We're okay. They're releasing us. Where are you? Somewhere in Virginia, Jonas said. They've been treating us well, but they made it clear what would happen if we talked. That's about to change, I said. Over the next hour, I explained what I'd done. The evidence uploaded to servers around the world, the journalists standing by with the story, the dead man's switch that would release everything if anything happened to us. You did it, Kaylee said. You actually did it. We did it. All of us. But even as I said the words, I knew the victory was incomplete. We'd forced a stalemate, not a revelation. The evidence would come out, but slowly, carefully, in ways that could be managed and controlled. 3 days later, the first stories began appearing in small publications. A maritime journal in Norway published satellite photos showing unexplained vessels near the TWA 800 crash site. A defense industry newsletter mentioned discrepancies in radar data from July 17th, 1996. Larger outlets picked up the stories gradually, The Washington Post ran a piece questioning whether the TWA 800 investigation had examined all possibilities. The Guardian published an investigation into witness statements that had been excluded from the official report. But there was no sudden revelation, no dramatic exposé. The truth emerged like a slow leak, impossible to stop but easy to ignore for those who didn't want to see it. Jonas, Kaylee and I were left alone. We weren't relocated or silenced, but we weren't celebrated either. We'd become custodians of an inconvenient truth, watching as the world slowly, reluctantly acknowledged what we'd discovered. 6 months after our confrontation at the Space Needle, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in Callum's precise font. 2 objects, 1 test, 1 shield. Radar masking was never designed for civilian airspace. I tried to warn them. Now the echoes keep me up. Below that, in handwriting I didn't recognise, your brother understood the price of truth. Some echoes never fade. I kept the note in my desk drawer next to the few personal effects Callum had left behind. Sometimes, late at night, I would take it out and read it again, wondering if I'd done the right thing. The truth was out there now, scattered across servers and publications around the world. But it was a truth that came with a cost. 230 people had died on July 17th, 1996. Not in a tragic accident, but as collateral damage in a military test gone wrong. Their families deserved to know. The world deserved to know. But knowing came with its own burden, its own weight of responsibility. 5 years later, I was living in a small town outside Helsinki, working as a consultant for a Finnish defence contractor. The name on my passport was different, though I'd never officially changed it. Sometimes you just become someone else, one day at a time. I was checking aviation forums that morning when I found the post. It had been uploaded anonymously to a site that tracked unexplained radar contacts. CVN 73 wasn't the only thing hiding that night. Check coordinates 40.6392 degrees north, 72.6828 degrees west for July 17th, 1996, 1900 hours, 45:2100 hours UTC. Look for the ghost signals. The coordinates were precise, exactly where TWA 800 had exploded. I downloaded the radar data attached to the post. It was different from anything I'd seen before, with much higher resolution and timestamps that showed activity beginning almost an hour before the official incident time. The data showed what looked like a coordinated naval exercise, with multiple vessels moving into position throughout the afternoon. But more interesting were the ghost signals, radar contacts that appeared and disappeared in patterns that suggested advanced stealth technology. Someone had been testing more than just missile systems that night. They'd been testing ways to hide entire fleets from detection. I stared at the data for hours, cross-referencing it with weather reports, shipping schedules and flight paths from that day. The picture that emerged was of a massive military operation, far more complex than anything Jonas or Kaylee or I had imagined. At the bottom of the post was a single line of text. The echoes remember what we choose to forget. I printed out the data and filed it with the rest of my collection. 25 years of accumulated evidence about what had really happened on July 17th, 1996. Someday, when enough time had passed, when the people responsible were dead or too old to care, maybe the full truth would come out. But for now, I was content to be a keeper of echoes, a guardian of uncomfortable truths. I walked outside into the Finnish winter, breathing air so cold it burned my lungs. Above me, stars shone with a clarity impossible in most populated places, points of light that had travelled unimaginable distances to reach my eyes. Somewhere out there, radio waves were still bouncing around the planet, carrying fragments of conversations from July 17th, 1996. Phantom signals that would circle the Earth for decades, gradually fading but never completely disappearing. The sky remembers everything, I thought, even the things we try to forget, especially those. I pulled out my phone and composed a brief message. Still here, still watching, still remembering. Then I sent it to a number I'd memorised but never called, knowing it would reach someone, somewhere, who understood that some truths are too important to die with their discoverers. In the distance, an aircraft passed overhead, its navigation lights blinking red and green against the starlit sky. Ordinary people travelling to ordinary destinations, unaware of the ghost that flew beside them. But I knew they were there. Jonas knew. Kaylee knew. And somewhere in the vast network of servers and satellites that connected our world, the evidence waited patiently for its moment to surface again. Because the truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful people try to bury it. Even when it takes 25 years to claw its way back to the light. I turned and walked back toward my house, leaving footprints in the snow that the wind would soon erase. But the echoes would remain, bouncing through the darkness, waiting for someone with the courage to listen. We looked to the stars for truth, I thought, remembering Callum's final words. But the lie was launched from below, and in the end, the sky remembers everything. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains, 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Dyatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel, they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Dyatlov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled the Evening Autoton, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Dyatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Dyatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kolat, which in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Dyatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vijay by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolat when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish-brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these 2 friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 metres away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Dyatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Dyatlov was better dressed than the 2 under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Dyatlov, searchers found Zina Kolmogorova, a 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 metres from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others, He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 AM or PM, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Dyatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 metres beyond the cedar and 1,500 metres from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 metres of snow. These were Lyudmila, Luda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were lying about 75 metres further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolovatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these 3 had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The 4th person in the ravine, Alexander Kolovatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolovatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All 4 of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolovatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes. However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The 4 in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Manatee people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Dyatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Dyatlov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Mazyak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan, and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Dyatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogoreva's mother, for instance, and Igor Dyatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Dyatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Dyatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, here we are decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Dyatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Dyatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Dyatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, Recovered journal entry, classification redacted. Subject, Eli Granger, independent journalist. Date range, July 15th to 18th, 2023. Location, Bohemian Grove, Monte Rio, California. The following document was recovered from an encrypted server farm in Iceland. The journalist's current whereabouts remain unknown. Ed. My name is Eli Granger, and I'm writing this because I may not live long enough to tell it in person. What I witnessed in the redwoods of Northern California will haunt me until my dying day, whenever that may come. It started 3 weeks ago with an email that shouldn't have existed. I was in my cramped Oakland apartment, nursing my third cup of coffee, and scrolling through encrypted channels where whistleblowers sometimes surface. My secure inbox pinged. A message from an address that was just a string of numbers and letters, routed through 7 different proxy servers. No subject line, just an attachment and 4 lines of text. You want truth? Go to the redwoods. Bring a black suit and a quiet soul. July 15th to 18th. The fire reveals all. The attachment was a high-resolution scan of what appeared to be a guest registry for the Bohemian Grove. That mysterious all-male retreat where the world's most powerful men allegedly gather each summer to commune with nature. I'd written about the Grove before, relying on second-hand accounts and leaked photographs from the 1980s. But this was different. The names on the list made my blood run cold. Former presidents, current senators, military contractors whose companies I'd been investigating for years. CEOs of tech giants, pharmaceutical corporations, defense contractors, media moguls who controlled the narrative of entire nations, all scheduled to attend something called the Midsummer Encampment. At the bottom of the scan was a forged access pass with my photograph, a professional headshot I'd never sent to anyone, digitally altered to show me in a black suit and tie. The name read Edmund Gray, Logistics Consultant, Prometheus Industries. Someone with serious resources wanted me inside that grove. The question was why? I should have walked away. Should have deleted the email and gone back to writing about municipal corruption and corporate tax avoidance. Safe stories. Stories that didn't get journalists killed. Instead, I packed a black suit and drove north to Sonoma County. The road to Monte Rio winds through some of the most beautiful country in California. Ancient redwoods tower over narrow highways, their canopy so thick that midday feels like twilight. It's the kind of place where you'd expect to find hippie communes and organic wineries, not shadowy cabals plotting the fate of nations. But as I learned in my Navy intelligence days, the most dangerous secrets are always hidden in the most innocent places. I parked at a motel in Gurneville and walked the perimeter of the Bohemian Grove property that evening. 2,000 acres of private forest, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Security cameras every 50 feet, motion sensors in the trees, the kind of setup you'd expect around a military installation, not a summer camp for rich men. The main gate was staffed by guards who looked more like special forces operators than private security. Black uniforms, tactical gear, the flat stare of men who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Whatever happened inside those redwoods, they were serious about keeping it secret. The forged pass worked perfectly, too perfectly. The guards scanned the barcode, checked my face against the photo, and waved me through without a second glance. Either the forger was a genius, or someone very powerful wanted me inside. Neither possibility was comforting. The grove itself was exactly as described in the leaked accounts I'd read. Massive redwood trees, some over 1,000 years old, stretched toward a canopy so thick it blocked out the sun. Gravel paths wound between rustic cabins and open-air lodges, each marked with whimsical names: Owl's Nest, Dragon's Den, Caveman's Lodge. It would have been charming if not for the underlying sense of wrongness that permeated everything. The other guests, I couldn't think of them as normal people, not after seeing that registry, moved through this camp with the easy confidence of men accustomed to absolute power. They wore casual clothes during the day, khakis, polo shirts, boat shoes, the uniform of American aristocracy. But their conversations, caught in fragments as I passed, revealed the true scope of their influence. The Shanghai Index will drop exactly 17%. Tell the secretary that Operation Nightfall is greenlit for October. Media blackout should hold for at least 72 hours. I posed as a logistics consultant, which gave me an excuse to wander the grounds with a clipboard and camera phone, confiscated at the gate and replaced with an approved device that couldn't access external networks. The cover story worked well enough. Rich men are accustomed to being served by invisible people who handle the mundane details of their lives. But as the day wore on, I began to notice the symbols. Owls everywhere. Carved into tree trunks, etched on building facades, worked into the designs of benches and lampposts. Not cute, friendly owls. These were stylized, angular, with eyes that seemed to follow you as you walked past. The largest was a 40-foot stone statue positioned on a small island in an artificial lake at the heart of the grove. Even in daylight, it radiated a sense of ancient malevolence. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to find a man in his 70s watching me stare at the giant owl. Silver hair, expensive casual wear, the kind of artificial tan that comes from winters in Palm Beach. His eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost colourless. The Owl of Bohemia, he continued, joining me at the lake's edge. Been watching over this place for over a century. Some say it's just decorative, others know better. Know better how? I asked, immediately regretting the question. I was supposed to be invisible, unremarkable. The old man smiled, revealing teeth too white and too perfect for his age. You'll see tonight, Mr. Grey. The cremation of care waits for no man, not even consultants. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me staring at the owl statue and wondering how much my cover had already been blown. That evening, as twilight settled over the grove, the atmosphere changed completely. The casual bonhomie of the day disappeared, replaced by something far more serious and ritualistic. Men emerged from their cabins wearing dark robes with hoods that obscured their faces. Some carried torches, others strange ceremonial objects I couldn't identify. I found a dark robe hanging in my assigned cabin, along with a note. Attendance is mandatory. Silence is sacred. The owl sees all. What I witnessed that night will stay with me forever. As darkness fell, hundreds of robed figures processed through the forest paths, converging on the lake where the great owl statue loomed. Torches flickered between the trees like malevolent fireflies. The only sounds were footsteps on gravel and the whisper of fabric against bark. I followed the crowd, keeping my head down and my hood up. The robe smelled of incense and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. We gathered in a natural amphitheatre around the lake. The owl statue dominated the scene, its eyes seeming to glow red in the torchlight. A wooden boat had been prepared at the water's edge, and in it lay what appeared to be the effigy of a child, small, wrapped in white cloth, disturbingly lifelike. But as I stared at the bundle, a horrible doubt crept into my mind. The proportions were too perfect, the weight distribution too natural. The way the cloth clung to what lay beneath suggested something more substantial than straw and sawdust. A figure in an elaborate robe stepped onto a platform beside the owl. Even with his face hidden, I recognised the bearing and voice of a man who'd been on television every night for years. A former president whose policies had shaped a generation. Brothers of the Grove, his voice boomed across the water, amplified by hidden speakers. We gather once again beneath the ancient eyes of wisdom to perform the sacred rite that frees us from the burdens of conscience. The crowd responded in unison. We banish care and cast it to the flames. Care, that pale and common thing that binds the hands of power. Care that whispers doubt in the ears of decision. Care that stays the sword of necessary action. We banish care and cast it to the flames. The ritualized call and response continued for nearly an hour. Invocations to ancient deities whose names I recognized from my study of Middle Eastern mythology. Moloch, the Carthaginian god of child sacrifice. Enlil, the Mesopotamian lord of wind and authority. Names that shouldn't have been spoken by American leaders in the 21st century. But the most disturbing element wasn't the pagan imagery, or even the suggestions of child sacrifice. It was the casual way these men, titans of industry, shapers of policy, guardians of democracy, participated in rituals that explicitly celebrated the abandonment of human compassion. The ceremony reached its climax when the boat carrying the effigy was pushed out onto the lake. Flames erupted from the water around it, hidden gas jets, I realised, creating the illusion of supernatural fire. The figure in the boat burned quickly, the white cloth falling away to reveal... I still can't be certain what I saw. In the flickering light, with smoke obscuring my vision and my mind reeling from the horror of it all, it might have been an elaborately constructed mannequin. The realistic movement could have been caused by the flames consuming internal supports. The sounds, brief, high-pitched, quickly cut off, might have been air escaping from burning materials. But the way some of the robed figures wept as the fire consumed its offering, the way others cheered with genuine ecstasy, suggested something far more sinister than theatrical pageantry. As the flames died down, the crowd began to disperse. I started to follow them back toward the cabins, but a hand fell on my shoulder. Mr. Grey. It was the old man from earlier, still wearing his ceremonial robes. You're invited to the inner circle gathering. A rare honour for a consultant. Before I could refuse, two other figures flanked me. Not threatening exactly, but their presence made it clear that declining wasn't an option. They led me deeper into the forest, away from the main paths, to a clearing I hadn't seen during my earlier reconnaissance. Here, perhaps 30 men stood in a circle around a fire pit carved directly into the bedrock. Unlike the theatrical grandeur of the main ceremony, this felt ancient and deadly serious. The inner circle ritual began at midnight. The participants had exchanged their dark robes for masks of polished bone, owl faces with hollow eye sockets that seemed to bore into your soul. They moved with practiced precision, suggesting this ceremony had been performed countless times before. The man who'd led the earlier ritual stepped into the centre of the circle. Without his presidential bearing and familiar voice, he seemed diminished. Just another acolyte serving powers older than nations. Brothers of the Inner Grove, he intoned, we gather to receive the wisdom of the Ancient Ones, and to consecrate the plans that will shape the world's destiny. The response came in a language I didn't recognise at first, harsh consonants and guttural vowels that seemed to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to something primal and terrified in the human psyche. But as my Navy intelligence training kicked in, I began to parse familiar elements. This was Akkadian, the ancient language of Mesopotamia, dead for over 2,000 years. They were chanting the names of forgotten gods and promising them sacrifices of nations. Symbols were drawn in the ash around the fire pit, not random occult doodles, but specific sigils I recognised from declassified CIA documents. Project MK-Ultra had experimented with ritualistic programming, using ancient symbols and dead languages to bypass conscious resistance in human subjects. The research had supposedly been discontinued in the 1970s. Apparently it had just moved to a more exclusive venue. The ceremony continued for hours. Maps were produced and spread on the ground, not of geographical territories, but of economic zones, resource deposits, population centres. Plans were discussed in a mixture of English and Akkadian, but the intent was clear enough. Wars to be started, governments to be toppled, populations to be controlled. And through it all, the participants spoke of themselves not as American leaders serving American interests, but as servants of the Ancient Ones, preparing the world for some greater transformation. "The harvest approaches," one masked figure intoned. "The sleepers must be awakened. The old seals must be broken." "In the name of those who wait in the deep places," the circle responded, "let the work continue." I crouched in the shadows beyond the firelight, recording everything on a digital audio device I'd hidden in my shoe. But as the night wore on, I began to understand that what I was witnessing wasn't just corruption or conspiracy in any conventional sense. These men genuinely believed they were serving inhuman masters. Whether those masters were real or imagined didn't matter. The policies they were planning would affect millions of lives based on the whims of entities that viewed humanity as livestock. The ritual concluded with each participant drinking from a silver chalice and making individual pledges. The liquid looked black in the firelight, and several men convulsed briefly after drinking, their eyes rolling back to show only white. As dawn approached, the circle dissolved. The participants removed their masks, revealed themselves to be exactly who I'd suspected. Former presidents, current senators, military leaders, corporate titans. They shook hands and exchanged quiet words like businessmen concluding a profitable meeting, which in a sense they were. I made it back to my cabin as the first light filtered through the redwood canopy, but I knew I couldn't stay much longer. Whatever protection my forged identity provided was wearing thin. Too many meaningful looks, too many knowing smiles. They were playing with me, letting me see just enough to understand the scope of what I'd stumbled into. But there was one more place I needed to investigate before I could flee. The lodge marked Styx, access by code only, sat apart from the main camp, connected by a service road that didn't appear on any of the maps provided to guests. I'd noticed it during my first day's reconnaissance, but hadn't found an opportunity to investigate. The building itself was unremarkable. Standard wooden construction that matched the other lodges, designed to blend into the forest environment. But the security was anything but standard. Biometric scanners, electromagnetic locks, motion sensors that could detect a heartbeat from 50 feet away. Fortunately, my anonymous benefactor had provided more than just a forged access pass. Hidden in the lining of my suit jacket was a USB device that looked like a standard thumb drive, but contained sophisticated hacking tools developed by someone with serious technical skills. When plugged into the lodge's security system, it created a temporary blind spot in the sensors and provided the access codes needed to bypass the locks. Whoever wanted me to see what lay inside had planned this infiltration down to the smallest detail. The lodge's interior was a facade. Behind a false wall accessed by yet another hidden panel, stairs led down into the bedrock beneath the forest. The passage was older than the buildings above, carved stone rather than modern construction, lit by electric fixtures that had been retrofitted into ancient sconces. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy oak door opened onto a chamber that took my breath away. The room stretched far beyond what should have been possible given the lodge's footprint above. Stone shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound journals, rolled documents, and artefacts that seemed to span centuries. At the centre of the chamber stood a massive table carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface covered with maps, blueprints, and what appeared to be governmental documents bearing official seals. I started with the journals, selecting one at random from a shelf marked 1923 to 1945. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, but the contents were anything but quaint. The European situation proceeds according to plan. Our associates in Berlin understand their role. though they believe themselves to be serving the fatherland rather than the ancient ones. The sacrifice of the lesser peoples will provide the spiritual energy necessary for the next phase of the great work. Another journal, this one more recent. Operation Mockingbird exceeds all expectations. The media outlets respond to our guidance without question, believing they serve journalistic integrity, while actually perpetuating the narratives required for population control. The sleeping masses accept whatever reality we provide. But it was the documents on the central table that truly shattered my understanding of how the world worked. Blueprints for the USA Patriot Act dated 6 months before September 11th, 2001. Battle plans for the invasion of Iraq, complete with fabricated intelligence reports about weapons of mass destruction. Early drafts of social media algorithms designed not to connect people, but to divide them into manageable, controllable factions. And newer documents that made my blood run cold. Plans for a global pandemic response that prioritized control over public health. Blueprints for digital currency systems that would eliminate financial privacy entirely. Population reduction strategies disguised as environmental initiatives. The most disturbing document was a roster of participants going back to the 1870s, when the Bohemian Club was first founded. Names I recognised from history textbooks, titans of the Gilded Age who'd shaped America's industrial development. But also names that shouldn't have been there. Figures from much earlier periods, some dating back centuries. Either the record keeping was fantastically inaccurate, or some of these participants weren't entirely human. At the bottom of the most recent page, a note in fresh handwriting. E. Granger, journalist, witnessed inner circle ceremony. July 16th, 2023. Asset or liability. Recommend termination if no compliance by dawn July 18th. They knew exactly who I was, had known from the moment I'd walked through their gates, the anonymous email, the forged pass, the convenient access codes. It had all been an elaborate test, and I was apparently failing. A motion sensor somewhere in the chamber beeped softly. Red lights began flashing along the walls. In the distance I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps descending the stone stairs. I grabbed as many documents as I could carry, stuffed them into my jacket and looked for another way out. But there was only one exit, and it was about to be filled with very unfriendly people. The footsteps were getting closer. Voices echoed down the stairwell, professional, clipped, the kind of tactical communication used by military operators. But then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in hellish red. And in that brief moment of darkness, I heard something that shouldn't have been possible. A voice speaking directly into my mind, words that bypassed my ears entirely. Run, little journalist. Run and tell the world what you've seen, but know that the telling will be your doom, and the world's salvation requires far greater sacrifices than one man's life. When the emergency light stabilised, a section of the stone wall had opened, revealing a narrow tunnel that led deeper into the earth. I didn't hesitate. Whatever entity had just spoken to me, whether it was one of the ancient ones or something else entirely, it was offering me a chance to escape. I took it. The tunnel system beneath the grove was extensive and clearly ancient. Carved passages connected natural caves, creating a network that probably extended for miles underground. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those I'd seen during the inner circle ceremony, but these were older, deeper, worn smooth by centuries of whatever had moved through these spaces. I followed the main passage for what felt like hours, guided by phosphorescent moss that provided just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles. Behind me, I could hear sounds of pursuit, voices, flashlight beams, the occasional echo of radio communication. But the sounds were growing fainter, suggesting that my pursuers either couldn't find the tunnel entrance or were reluctant to follow me into the deep places beneath the forest. Eventually the passage began to slope upward. Fresh air carried the scent of rain and growing things. A natural opening concealed by hanging vines led out into the forest several miles from the main grove compound. I emerged to find the sky filled with storm clouds. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. Perfect cover for an escape, if I could make it to my car before the Grove security forces expanded their search perimeter. But as I made my way through the forest, I realised I wasn't alone. Figures moved between the trees, not the tactical teams I'd expected, but something far stranger. They wore the bone-white owl masks from the Inner Circle ceremony, but their movements were wrong, too fluid, too precise. And their eyes glowed with a faint bioluminescence that had nothing to do with reflected light. "The journalist sees too much," one of them said, the words somehow audible despite the increasing thunder. "The Ancient Ones are displeased." "But the compact must be honoured," another replied. "He was brought here for a purpose. Let him carry the message to the outer world. Let them know what awaits." I ran. Behind me, inhuman laughter echoed through the forest. Not pursuit exactly, but something far more unsettling. The sound of predators who were confident their prey could never truly escape. I reached my rental car as the storm broke in earnest. Rain pounded the windshield as I drove through the night, taking back roads and avoiding the main highways. In my jacket pocket, the stolen documents felt like they were burning against my chest. But I'd made it out. I had evidence. I had proof of the conspiracy that shaped world events from the shadows of a California forest. Or so I thought. I uploaded everything to an offshore server farm in Iceland. Documents, audio recordings, photographs, detailed notes of everything I'd witnessed. Multiple backup copies, distributed through anonymous networks, protected by military-grade encryption. Within 6 hours, every file had been corrupted or deleted. My apartment was ransacked while I was at an internet cafe, uploading the files. Nothing obviously stolen, but every electronic device had been confiscated or destroyed. My laptop, phone, backup drives, even the digital camera I'd left in a drawer, all gone. The mainstream media ignored my story completely. Alternative news sites that initially showed interest suddenly went silent. Forum posts about the Grove were deleted within minutes of being posted. It was as if the entire internet had been scrubbed of any reference to what I'd discovered. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night since my escape, I've been visited by visions of the Ancient Ones. Vast, tentacled entities that exist in spaces between dimensions, feeding on human suffering and preparing for some cosmic transformation that will remake reality according to their twisted desires. They show me glimpses of the future they're working to create. Cities drowned beneath black oceans, skies filled with screaming winds, populations reduced to cattle serving inhuman masters. And they whisper that I'm not a hero or a journalist or even a victim. I'm a messenger. They wanted someone to witness their ceremony, to understand the scope of their power, to carry word of their inevitable victory to the outside world. Not to warn humanity. Warnings imply the possibility of resistance, but to spread the despair that will make their final conquest easier. Every word I write, every person I tell, every attempt to expose the truth only serves their greater purpose. The corruption of hope, the murder of faith in human institutions, the slow transformation of free people into willing slaves. I'm writing this final entry from a motel room in Reno. I've been driving for 3 days, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. But I know it doesn't matter. They're not hunting me because they don't need to. I'm already serving their purpose just by existing, just by remembering what I saw in the Grove. The cremation of care wasn't just a ritual, it was a recruitment ceremony. And I wasn't an infiltrator, I was an initiate. Tonight, I'll drive east toward the desert. Maybe I'll find some way to break the cycle, to turn their own trap against them. Or maybe I'll just disappear into the wasteland and let the truth die with me. But if you're reading this, if somehow these words have reached you despite all their efforts to control the flow of information, then remember this. They call it the cremation of care, but what they really burn is conscience. And when the fires die down, the world grows a little colder, a little darker, a little more ready for the Ancient Ones to reclaim what they consider their rightful dominion. The fire in the Grove never really goes out. It just spreads, invisible and inexorable, consuming everything human until only the shadows remain. And in those shadows something very old and very hungry is waiting to be born. Envision the Black Ops trucks prowling nighttime highways, the hush of a top-secret hangar, the hum of hidden technology that defies earthly logic. And remember, as you listen, if the truth were truly out there, how far would powerful forces go to bury it, or bury those who discover it? Now, with the stage set, let us commence our journey alongside Jake Mercer, a regular, unassuming truck driver thrown headlong into a world of dark conspiracies and cosmic secrets. Buckle in, keep your headlights on, and prepare to traverse the lonely roads that lead straight into Area 51. Jake Mercer often said he'd seen it all during his years on the road, from giant dust storms in Arizona to sketchy rest stops on the outskirts of big cities. He'd once encountered a bull moose outside Boise that nearly totaled his rig. Another time a hitchhiker claimed to be a time traveller from the year 3010. Nothing shocked him anymore, until the day he was handed a government contract that came with an absurdly high paycheck and an equally absurd set of restrictions. It started on a scorching Wednesday afternoon in Albuquerque. Jake, nursing a cold energy drink, had just finished hauling medical supplies across state lines. While reviewing his next assignment, he noticed it was labelled High Priority Federal Clearance Required. His usual dispatcher, a gruff man named Martin, shrugged helplessly. "I don't know, Jake. They just said you're the driver for this. Pays triple, though. Don't ask me any more." The instructions were bizarre. Pick up a sealed freight container at a secure depot, no questions asked. Do not open or inspect the cargo under any circumstance. Follow the GPS coordinates to a location in the Nevada desert. Deliver by midnight, no exceptions. Speak to nobody about the nature of your load. Jake raised an eyebrow but accepted. Triple pay was triple pay, and there had been times he could barely cover the rig's maintenance. This job might set him up for months. Besides, he'd grown tired of daily monotony. A secret government contract carried a certain forbidden allure. He arrived at the secure depot by late afternoon. Towering barbed wire fences enclosed the yard, guarded by men in unmarked uniforms. A tall officer with the ice-cold eyes verified Jake's ID for an uncomfortably long time. Then, with a curt nod, he directed Jake to back his truck into a loading bay. 4 workers carefully rolled out a large metal container, about 20 feet long, its edges sealed with rivets. It had no markings except a small stenciled code, R51, classified. Jake watched them bolt the container to the truck's chassis. The officer approached again, thrusting a thick envelope into Jake's hands. "Your instructions. Stick to them. No detours. No curiosity. Understood?" Jake nodded. He could practically feel the tension in the air as though crossing some invisible threshold from routine life into the hush of clandestine operations. He hopped into his cab, fired up the engine, and eased away. Part of him expected to see black SUVs trailing him, but the roads around the depot were deserted. The miles slipped by in a haze of desert heat. With each passing hour, the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon a fierce orange, then a soft lavender. By dusk, Jake was coasting along an empty stretch of Nevada highway, the sign reading 75 miles to Groom Lake. He knew that name. It was rumoured to be near Area 51, the site of countless alien conspiracies. He snorted to himself. Aliens, right. Just bored people telling wild stories. Still, the distinct hush out here made him uneasy. Around 8 p.m, his radio crackled to life. "Jake? You out there?" The voice belonged to Maggie Ruiz, one of the nighttime dispatch operators he'd befriended over the years. She was a talkative soul who often kept him company on lonely drives. "Heard you took some big job," Jake hesitated. The instructions had been explicit, speak to nobody. But Maggie wasn't exactly nobody. She was a friend. Yeah, Mags. Some weird government contract. Pays well, though. Government, huh? They got you on hush-hush duty. You could say that, Jake admitted. Hey, can't chat much, the instructions. Gotcha, Maggie said, sounding intrigued. Well, I'll be on the line if you need me. Don't let them spooks get you. She ended the call with a laugh that only half concealed her curiosity. Silence returned, broken only by the whir of tyres on asphalt. Jake's mind drifted. Why all the secrecy? A new weapons system? High-tech gear? It's not your place to ask, he reminded himself. Then, from behind the truck, a faint sound reached his ears, a hollow clang like metal tapping on metal. He tensed. The cargo container was sealed. No reason it should make noise. Could something inside be shifting? He decided to ignore it. For half an hour the clang repeated every few minutes. Then it stopped. Jake's heart, however, continued to pound. He told himself it was just the rig's suspension or cargo settling. But a nagging thought persisted. What if something's alive in there? Night fell fully, and the desert around him turned into an expanse of blackness. With less than 60 miles to go, Jake planned to skip rest stops entirely. The job instructions demanded no stops. Fine by him. But the truck's fuel gauge told a different story. He'd miscalculated. He needed fuel or risked stalling short of the drop-off point. That spelled trouble on all fronts. Checking his map, he spotted a lone truck stop about 10 miles ahead. He considered the risk, but thirst and necessity overrode caution. He pulled in around 9:30 p.m. The place was half lit by flickering neon, a relic of the golden age of roadside diners. Only a couple of vehicles sat in the lot, an old station wagon and a battered pickup. Perfect. Less chance of prying eyes. Jake filled his tank, then stepped inside to pay. An elderly cashier nodded at him, barely curious. But just as Jake reached for his wallet, he felt something slip into his back pocket like a paper note. He whirled, scanning the aisles. He saw no one suspicious, only the old cashier slowly bagging items. Outside in the dim lot, Jake fished out the note. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "You're delivering more than just cargo. Watch your back." That was it. No signature, no explanation. Adrenaline surged in Jake's veins. Someone at this dusty rest stop recognized him, knew his job, and decided to warn him. He stuffed the note into his pocket, hurried back to his truck, and slammed the door shut. The container sat inert, moonlight reflecting off its metallic surface. "Watch my back," he muttered. "What's going on?" He stared at the container. The clang from earlier echoed in his memory. Curiosity gnawed at him. The contract said not to open the cargo, but the contract also never mentioned risking his life for ignorance. Gritting his teeth, Jake hopped down, grabbed a crowbar from the side compartment, and approached the sealed panel. If the old soldier at the checkpoint found out, Jake would lose his entire paycheck, maybe face legal trouble. But sometimes you have to see for yourself what you're hauling. He slid the crowbar under a seam, testing if the rivets could be pried loose. The metal groaned, then relented. Slowly, Jake lifted the edge, heart thudding with each inch. The interior was dark, but a faint chemical smell wafted out, a sterile tang reminiscent of hospitals. Then in the shadows he saw something that made his blood run cold. A heavy steel pod with a thick glass window. It was empty. Straps hung limp, as if they'd once held something in place. Jake felt the nape of his neck prickle. Something had been in that pod, but it wasn't there now. And that meant only one thing: it was loose, possibly inside the container, possibly outside. A flurry of possibilities seized him. He had to close it and drive, pretend ignorance, or he could investigate. but with each second his safe timeline shrank. The clock was ticking toward midnight. The cargo door he'd pried open wouldn't fully reseal without leaving evidence of tampering. Just then, a metallic clang echoed again from behind him. Jake spun around, crowbar at the ready, but saw nothing except dancing shadows. Fear twisted his gut. He needed to get out of here, ASAP. But how do you run from something unknown? He forced the container door shut as best he could, hopped into the cab and revved the engine. He had about 50 miles left to the coordinate, an unknown something presumably in tow, or on the loose. The note's warning replayed in his head. Danger lurked in the darkness, but he had a job to finish, however insane it was becoming. So Jake pressed the pedal, merging back onto the lonely highway. The thought of Area 51 no longer seemed so silly, because in that instant he knew one truth. This was no ordinary cargo, and he was no longer a simple truck driver. He was a man knee-deep in a conspiracy he couldn't yet fathom. As the highway unfurled beneath his wheels, Jake felt an unfamiliar sense of paranoia creeping in. He kept glancing at his side mirrors, half expecting government vehicles to appear with flashing lights. But the desert remained eerily quiet. He turned on his CB radio, hoping to reach Maggie again, some connection to normalcy. Static hissed, then Maggie's voice cut through. "Jake, that you? I was wondering if you'd gone silent for good." "Maggie," he said, his own voice shaky. "Listen, something's off. This cargo, whatever's inside it, it might have... I don't know, it's just not right." He hesitated to reveal everything, scanning the empty road ahead. I opened it, found a locked pod. Empty, like it was meant to hold something alive. The line crackled with tension. "Alive? Jake, that's not good. Did you see anything else?" "No, just straps." Then I heard noises, like metal scraping. "Something's loose, Mags. Could be an animal, or..." He couldn't bring himself to say the word alien, but the possibility danced in his thoughts. She inhaled sharply. "This is big. You sure you want to keep going?" Jake's foot pressed on the accelerator. "I've come too far. I've got to finish the drop. Maybe once I'm at the base they'll handle whatever it is. Then I'm done. Paid. Out." "Okay. But keep me updated. I'll see if I can dig up anything on that container code you mentioned, R51. Might be referencing Area 51, or it could be something else. Just be careful." He ended the call feeling slightly better, knowing someone had his back. The desert night pulled him deeper in. A battered sign reading "Restricted access beyond this point" loomed up, complete with additional warnings about lethal force. His GPS insisted he was on course. The drop-off coordinate flickered on the screen, still about 30 miles away. A swirling dust devil crossed the highway, forcing Jake to slow. For a moment he thought he spotted headlights behind him, but when he looked again, they were in. Another flicker of paranoia. Focus on driving. At the next bend the road became narrower, lined with chain-link fences sporting no trespassing placards. This was definitely a different world, someplace built to discourage visitors. At last, around 11:20 p.m, the GPS beeped. "You have arrived at your destination." He found himself at a tall automated gate. A small speaker next to it crackled. "State your clearance code," a monotone voice demanded. Jake fumbled through the envelope for a badge with a printed code. He read it into the speaker. The gate groaned open. No turning back now. Beyond the gate, wide asphalt fields stretched out, dotted with hangars and low buildings. Dim security lights revealed soldiers patrolling. Jake was directed by glowing cones to an underground entrance, reminiscent of a bunker. The entire operation exuded secrecy, and the air felt thick with tension. A pair of uniformed men flagged him down. One motioned him into a cavernous elevator platform large enough for the truck. As it descended, the walls became concrete. Jake's heart hammered. He was going underground, presumably beneath the base's surface. The platform settled in a subterranean loading area, bright fluorescent lights washing everything in an antiseptic glow. Armed guards approached. One barked, "Power down the truck. Step out with your hands visible." Jake complied, squinting under the stark lights. Another guard used a scanning device over the container's locks. Jake tensed. Would they notice I pried it open? A beep. The guard frowned. "The container's seal is compromised. Sir, did you tamper with this?" Jake's breath caught. He forced an even tone. "No. Must have come loose on the road." The guard stared daggers at him, unconvinced. Before the interrogation could deepen, a tall figure in a crisp suit appeared, a man exuding authority. He wore no name tag, but his demeanour demanded respect. "Take the container," he told the guards. "I'll handle the driver." He turned to Jake, his gaze cold. "I'm Agent Nathan Cole. Follow me. Now." Jake had no choice. Agent Cole led him through a set of steel doors into a windowless corridor that seemed to stretch forever, each side bearing identical sealed rooms. They reached a small antechamber where Cole fixed him with a glare. "You're not to speak of anything you see here. I assume you read your contract?" Jake swallowed, trying to maintain composure. "Yes." "Good, because if you break your silence, we'll know. We always know." Cole paused, as if relishing the intimidation. "You'll wait here until we confirm the cargo. Then you'll be escorted off the premises." Jake gave a stiff nod. The door slammed shut, leaving him in a Spartan waiting area with 2 chairs and a silent guard. Minutes bled into an hour. Jake's mind whirred, replaying the ominous note, the empty pod, the possibility that some creature roamed free. He couldn't just leave. He had to at least see it through. Yet now he was stuck, evidently untrusted. Suddenly, a blaring siren echoed down the corridor. The guard stiffened, pressing a finger to his earpiece. Muffled orders came through. Another beep, a door slid open, and a frantic voice barked, "We have a breach. Unidentified subject loose in Sector C. Secure all entry points." Jake's eyes widened. Sector C? Is that where they took the container? The guard dashed out, leaving Jake momentarily unguarded. Fear and adrenaline collided. If something truly broke loose, a creature perhaps, this place was about to become a war zone, and Jake had no desire to be trapped in the crossfire. He took a risk, slipping out of the waiting area into the corridor. Sirens kept howling and red emergency lights strobed. He turned a corner, nearly colliding with a cluster of uniformed men sprinting in the opposite direction. They ignored him, focused on the crisis deeper inside the facility. Jake spotted a sign that read, "Warehouse access, authorized personnel only." Heart pounding, he reasoned that was likely where his cargo had been stored. Maybe he could glimpse the truth. Maybe he could find answers, and maybe find an exit, because once the base settled, they'd probably arrest or worse. If I see something incriminating, maybe I can force my release. Steeling his courage, he slipped through the door and descended a short flight of steps. The hallway ended in a large open area that resembled an aircraft hangar, only it was buried underground. Harsh fluorescent lights shone over crates, pods and containers, and near the centre, resting on a heavy-duty dolly, was his container, the side panel still parted from his crowbar attempt. Military personnel crowded around, rifles at the ready. A slender, bespectacled man in a lab coat kneeled by the container, rummaging through what appeared to be alien-like apparatus inside. Jake recognised him from a news article he'd read about government scientists, Dr. Eli Voss, but the man looked older, haunted, his face drawn in panic. Jake crept closer, ducking behind some crates. He glimpsed inside the container, strange devices with glowing lines, a cylindrical capsule that must have once held the occupant of the steel pod. Dr. Voss fiddled with an electronic console as if trying to lock something down. Another soldier shouted, "We have movement in the vents, Sector C!" Chaos reigned. In the swirl of confusion, a shadow flickered across the far wall, tall and spindly, shifting unnaturally quick. Jake's blood chilled. Was that the creature? A guard fired a shot. Shouts erupted. "Hold your fire! We need it alive!" Another soldier scrambled to raise a tranquilizer rifle. Then, to Jake's horror, the shadow vanished from the wall and reappeared on the ceiling, impossibly defying gravity. Staccato gunfire erupted, the muzzle flashes lighting up the space in blinding arcs. Something hissed, a weird, unearthly keening. Then silence, broken by a guard's scream. Jake's instinct screamed at him to run, but his body froze. A part of him was transfixed by the bizarre reality unfolding. Something not of this world scuttled across the ceiling, too fast to track. Soldiers cursed and swung rifles upward. In the chaos, Dr. Voss turned, scanning the room. His eyes locked onto Jake, half hidden behind a crate. In that moment, recognition flickered in the scientist's gaze. Maybe he pegged Jake as a civilian who shouldn't be there. But instead of raising an alarm, Voss mouthed something akin to "Get out!" Jake's heart hammered. Did he dare trust this man? The swirling lights, the shouts, the lurking predator overhead. There was no time to weigh options. Dr. Voss beckoned, then pointed toward a door marked "Exit, Vehicle Hangar." Jake nodded mutely, realizing this might be his only chance to escape. Then, just as he started to move, another ear-shattering alarm blared. The creature hissed again, and the lights flickered, plunging the entire base into partial darkness. Jake felt the temperature in the hangar drop, or perhaps it was just cold sweat dripping down his back. The overhead fluorescent tubes sputtered, struggling to keep the space lit. In that half-lit gloom, shadows sprawled across the walls like living things. The shape of the creature, so swift and unnatural, kept flickering in his peripheral vision. Dr. Eli Voss dashed across the concrete floor, nearly tripping over a supply crate. Jake followed, keeping low. Gunshots echoed again, followed by a soldier's panicked shout. Then a monstrous clang of metal on metal, like something heavy was battered aside. One more shriek cut through the confusion, then silence. The hush was deafening, charged with primal fear. Voss and Jake reached the side door labelled "Exit Vehicle Hangar," but it was locked by an electronic key panel. Cursing under his breath, Voss fumbled for a keycard, swiped it, and the panel beeped red. Access denied. Another attempt. Same result. "Damn it!" Voss hissed, his voice quivering. He slapped the panel in frustration. They must have initiated lockdown. I need a higher clearance. He glanced over his shoulder. We'll have to find another way out. Jake's mind reeled. Doc, what the hell is in here? Did something break out of that container? Voss closed his eyes briefly as if in pain. Yes, it's an entity we recovered from a crash site. Part biological, part mechanical, still learning about it, but we call it Xenoform Beta. We had it sedated, locked in stasis, until your container got compromised. He cast Jake a conflicted look, half guilt, half blame. Now it's loose. Jake's stomach clenched. This is insane. Let's just get out. If that thing's